All right, today we're jumping into the book of Ezekiel, and we're going to zero in on just one chapter. Why? Because this one chapter acts as the critical turning point for the entire story, and it's where we see a prophet of doom completely transform into a messenger of hope. Okay, so let's set the scene here. For 23 straight chapters, the prophet Ezekiel, who's in exile, has been hammering his people with these relentless messages of judgment coming for Jerusalem. Now, his fellow exiles, they thought the city was invincible, but Ezekiel knew better. And right here in chapter 24, all those warnings, they stop, and reality kicks in. So the chapter kicks off, and it's not with some far-off vision of the future. Nope, it's direct command about the present. God speaks to Ezekiel on a very specific day and announces that the siege of Jerusalem, the one he's been warning about for years, has finally begun. God is so emphatic here. He says, write this down this very day. It's this incredibly powerful moment where prophecy is literally being etched into the historical record in real time. This isn't some vague, someday prediction anymore. It is a date-stamped historical event. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for scholars. This very specific date actually creates a little bit of a puzzle. When they start comparing it to other timelines in the book, especially one that pops up later in chapter 33, it looks like there might be a chronological contradiction. You see, most of the time, Ezekiel dates events based on when he was taken into exile. It's his personal timeline, you know? But right here, the text suddenly switches to the official dating system, the one used by the royal court, tied to the king's reign. It's the same system you'd find in the Book of 2 Kings. So, why the switch? Well, the takeaway here isn't that this is some kind of biblical error. No way. It's actually a super deliberate literary flag planted by an editor. By using the official, historical dating method, the text is practically shouting at the reader, pay attention, this is the day. It's the moment everything changes, tying Ezekiel's prophecy directly to the official history of Israel. All right, next up, to really drive home the grim reality of what's happening to the city, God gives Ezekiel a parable he has to act out. And this isn't just a story he tells, it's like a piece of performance art with a really terrifying message. He's commanded to get a big cooking pot, get a fire roaring underneath it, fill it with water, and then throw in the best cuts of meat, the choice pieces of the flock. You know, it looks like he's starting to make a stew, but this represents something way more sinister. And there's no mystery here about what this all means. The symbolism is made explicit right away. The pot sitting over the fires of the siege, that's the city of Jerusalem. It's a container being heated to a boiling point, just like the city is being surrounded and cooked by the Babylonian army. But then the text throws us a little curveball. It starts talking about a corrosion, or a rust that's inside the pot. This is a bit of a puzzle, because a few verses later, we're told the pot was made of copper. And, well, copper doesn't rust. So if the pot itself isn't the problem, what is? And it turns out the corrosion isn't literal rust on the metal. It's a metaphor. It represents the moral decay of the people inside the pot. The city itself, you know, the buildings and the streets, they aren't the issue. It's the inhabitants whose actions have just corrupted the whole thing from the inside out. Think about it. They were called the choice pieces because they were God's chosen people. They had every advantage. But their rebellion, their injustice, it had turned them into something rotten. This whole parable is a really stark declaration that the city's elite aren't being refined by this fire, they're being boiled away like garbage. And just when you think it can't get any more intense, the story pivots from this public parable to something deeply, almost unbearably personal for the prophet himself. I mean, this is just a gut punch. In a stunning turn, God tells Ezekiel that he is going to, suddenly, without any warning, take the life of his wife, the person the text calls the delight of his eyes. It's just this moment of profound and shocking divine intervention into the prophet's own home. And if that wasn't shocking enough, what God commands next it's just jarring. Ezekiel is explicitly forbidden from mourning. He can't perform any of the traditional public rituals. His private grief has to stay completely private. So what did this mean, practically? Well, no loud wailing. He had to keep his turban on instead of throwing dust on his head. He had to keep his sandals on, not go barefoot. He couldn't cover his face or eat the special meal that was part of the funeral rites. Every single external sign of grief was off limits.
This whole thing, this forced suppression of his own grief, is a perfect example of what theologians call a sign act. Basically, Ezekiel's personal tragedy isn't just his own anymore. His life has become a living, breathing parable for the whole nation. His actions are the message.
You see the parallel, right? Just as Ezekiel lost the delight of his eyes, the people were losing theirs, the holy city and its beautiful temple. And his silent, stoic response was meant to be their model. It actually mirrored God's own solemn resolve. The judgment was just, it was necessary, and it was not to be lamented. It was time for quiet acceptance of a very harsh reality. Okay, so this incredible personal loss is what signals the final major shift in the chapter. It ends one whole era of Ezekiel's ministry and kicks off the next one. You have to remember, for years, God had made Ezekiel partially mute. He could only speak when he was delivering a direct message from God. But now, God promises that when a fugitive finally arrives with the news that Jerusalem has fallen, his mouth will be opened, and he'll be able to speak freely again. And this is why chapter 24 is so critical. If you look at the whole book, you can see it's the perfect pivot point. The first 23 chapters are all warnings to Jerusalem. Now that the judgment has started, the book turns to judging Israel's enemies, and then, and this is so crucial, it shifts to a message of future hope and restoration. The doom part is over. Basically, Ezekiel's entire job description changes overnight. He's not the prophet of doom anymore. With the judgment now in the past, he becomes a shepherd, a watchman. His new task is to guide the survivors toward a new future and start rebuilding everything that was lost. And that leaves us with this really powerful question, doesn't it? What Ezekiel 24 shows us is that the path to restoration, to hope, it doesn't bypass grief and loss. It goes directly through it. It seems to suggest that sometimes the slate has to be wiped completely clean, no matter how painful that is, before a new and more hopeful future can finally be written.